Good evening. My name is Madeline Spencer, and I am a place manager in a minority majority city in Orange County, California. For tonight's dialogue, Porch Talk on Race and Place, we are using the porch as a metaphor. Yet this dialogue today is centered on what it means to be Black in an anti-Black world. It is about anti-Blackness, which extends to the design of the built environment and how we as people of color fit into our neighborhoods, cities, and our nation. At this moment, in our streets, we are amid a civil uprising in the face of anti-Blackness. I wanted to share this image from The Guardian of the banlieue on fire in France in 2015, which happened again in April of 2020. And this other image is a picture from the Philadelphia Inquirer here in the United States, which shows what is occurring now in Minneapolis. Neighborhoods. In the book, Against Architecture, the author Franco Lasecla wrote that the banlieues on the outskirts of France are discriminate. They represent a method of storage. They banish from the center a portion of the population considered less desirable. He asserted that this was key to understanding why the adolescent rage struck and damaged the cars within their own quarter. It was not just a wish for self-destruction, it was also a desire to physically cancel out the structure that held them away from the true city, those fences and barriers, those towns and squares that symbolize their being outside. The porch has interestingly and historically represented a safer place. Tonight, I am joined by a great panel of speakers who are here on the Zoom porch with me today, beginning with Jay Spitter from Toronto, Canada, award-winning placemaker and author of the forthcoming book, Where We Live. I am also with Sheila Foster from New York City, from the Scott Ginsburg Professor of Law and Policy at Georgetown, who works in the area of property, land use, and environmental justice in Washington, D.C. We also have with us Fay Darmawi, a film festival producer, community development banker, and urban planner in San Francisco, California. We also have James Rojas, who is from Oakland, California, and is a Latino urban planner, community activist, and artist, and the founder of Place It. We have Carmen Mays, who is the founder of Elevators from Birmingham, Alabama, which works to expand equity within uninvested legacy neighborhoods. And we have Stephen Jones, the multi-hyphenate marketing executive producer and content creator for people of color in Hollywood. And he is from Studio City of California.
Culturally speaking, when I think of what a front porch represents and means to me as an African American male, I think of safety, I think of community, and I think of storytelling. I can remember growing up in the Midwest and spending summers with my grandmother and watching her from her front porch in the comfort of her armchair share stories with neighbors and friends and anyone who would lend an ear. Those stories were about life, they were about love, they were about accountability, and they were about the power of God. She delivered those stories with such conviction that the front porch almost transformed into a sacred space or her sanctuary. She would share wisdom that she accrued from years of joy, pain, suffering, and fellowship with her Creator. I have taken on that mantle of storytelling and community empowerment through the medium of media as a television producer. It is my honor and a privilege to allow people who look like me see themselves reflected in ways that challenges them and inspires them to become their best selves. I have devoted my life's work to advocating on behalf of marginalized voices everywhere, using my work, which has essentially become my porch, to amplify messages of hope, inspiration, and equality for all. Creatively speaking, I've had the opportunity to be a part of several groundbreaking projects with Oprah Winfrey and her network. However, due to the current racial climate of our country and subsequently our world, I think it's most appropriate that I share a piece of work with you that I had an opportunity to work on as a producer with Black Hollywood to use our voices collectively to fight against police brutality. The name of this piece is called Someday is Today.
We shall overcome.
We shall overcome.
We shall overcome someday.
Deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome someday.
We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand someday.
Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe.
We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace.
We shall live in peace someday.
Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe.
We shall all be free. We shall all be free. We shall all be free someday.
Oh, deep in my heart, we are not afraid.
We are not afraid. We are not afraid. Today, deep in my heart,
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday.
Deep in my heart, I do believe.
We shall overcome someday. When is someday?
We're going to start now, and please share with us, each of you, your story. I wanted to start with Jay.
Begin by thanking Steve for sharing that powerful video. Thank you so much for that. When I think about a porch, I have very mixed feelings about that metaphor. As mentioned earlier, I think I'm located in Toronto, Ontario in Canada. I grew up in government housing, so I didn't have a porch. I lived in a poorly designed high-rise building. And so the only thing that I sort of had that might be akin to a porch is a very narrow, dark, dank hallway that we played in after school and a pretty scary urine-filled stairwell. And so the porch metaphor or the porch as a structure really didn't resonate with me for much of my life. Later on though, like in the past, I would say 5 years, I've done a lot of work in the US, working on the design and policy of public spaces. I've done a lot of Confederate monument work in the American South, and then also in a lot of Black majority cities. And so I've really had the privilege of coming to view the porch much like Steve describes it. So I know that in the South, especially, the porch is a site where elders trade neighborhood news. It's a site where people express community care. There's a lot of hair braiding happening on the porch, things like that. And so I definitely have a different maybe conceptualization of the porch now than I did earlier. And I guess in this moment, one of the things that is weighing heavily on me is why it is that Black folks cannot experience that kind of care and safety beyond the porch. So that's my question coming into this conversation.
Want to go next to Carmen?
Hey, yeah, so to piggyback off of what Jay said, I'm in Alabama and porches down here. I'm actually sitting on the front porch now. And so if you see me do this, it's summertime. You know, our state bird is the mosquito. So I'm just doing the best I can. Hopefully I'll be able to stay out here the whole time. But porches are very important. As I was recounting, I think, as I was thinking about my childhood home, And I think 5 generations of my family have used our porch, from my great grandmother to my grandparents, my parents, myself, and my nieces and nephews have all used that one porch. And we all have stories. It has been the backdrop for graduation pictures, prom pictures, Mother's Day pictures. I've been sad on that porch. I remember as a preteen, early teenager, I remember the porch was where my mom and I had our first real deep conversation about God, was on our front porch. The picture that you're seeing now is a recent picture that we took of my dad and my nephew, my youngest nephew. I have to make that distinction, don't want to leave anyone out. My youngest nephew and my dad reading on the front porch. And so it is very much a place of full humanity. I have, like I said before, I've experienced every emotion on our porch. And it wasn't until like, I mean, we gotta take it for granted. It wasn't until like I started thinking about this project that I really started to think about like, man, we really do spend a lot of time on our porch. And it really is important, even though it's not huge. And as you can see in the background of the picture, our neighbors are also on their porch. So for me, the porch is a place where I'm not only safe, but it's where I've been able to live out all aspects of my humanity, which again, to Jay's point, is not something that Black people get to do in many other spaces.
Fay, would you like to go next?
Hi, yes, hi, I'm Fay, and I am actually originally from Jakarta, Indonesia, and the porch as a safe space, what Madeline was talking about, has a specific distinctive definition in my hometown, mostly probably because we have been colonized by lots of different people. We were colonized by the Dutch for 350 years. We were occupied by the Japanese, and then we had a revolution, and we had to fight the British, the Americans, each other. So the porch was a place where we vetted people, where we were kind to strangers and we vetted them. We were hospitable. We would serve tea and cookies, but we were really checking them out to see if it was safe to invite them into the interior of the home. So that's the role of a porch. And I really appreciate having this opportunity to be in this conversation with folks, and just to express how enraged I am and sad that folks aren't feeling safe.
Amber?
Hi, everyone. It's so good to see you all again. And thank you, Madeline, for the invitation to come and join this conversation, such an important one right now. I am a daughter, a sister, 5 sisters. I'm a child of the South. I was born and raised in Louisiana. I like to say I came of age and into my grounding and rooting in work in the world in New Orleans, which is where, while we have the porch tradition throughout the South, in New Orleans was really where it was activated for me. The porch is highly used, highly utilized, and it acts as sort of this threshold space between the inner and the outer. It also acts as a gathering space, and in absence of a sort of the permission to occupy space in groups in other parts of the city, the porch became our personal commons. It became the place where we learned and practiced deep relationship. It became the place where stories were shared, where news was transmitted. It became the place of seeing and being seen, which is something deeply, deeply embedded in the culture of New Orleans. It's almost taboo to walk by someone, not almost, it is taboo to walk by someone and not say hello, because a mere hello is an acknowledgement of your life and your existence. So there's a deep, deep, profound humanity that emerged from the most Africanized city in the United States, New Orleans, that was practiced on porches. So that's my relationship to it and what I want to offer to the conversation here. The other piece, especially as it relates to race and place, is around housing and housing insecurity, and how insecurity and lack of physical security is created by design. And that not only within the design of the home itself, but the design and the layout of the city, and how racialization works through housing lines drawn and the redlining practice, which is a part of at least US racialized history, and how those lines drawn delineate space and space use. The gift and the radical optimism for me that I carry with me from New Orleans is that even within the suffocation of those lines, we were able and have been able to create these spaces of ritualized relationship that kept us human. And sometimes, it's why people come to the city of New Orleans, to get a little bit of that, to feel what it feels like to be fully human, accepted, embraced. So thank you. I'm excited to continue this conversation.
Thank you. Sheila.
So thank you for the conversation. It's a profound moment and brings back a lot of memories for me. I was born in Detroit at the end of the Motown era. And for me, the front of my parents' house in Detroit, when I was small, was a place of community. Detroit was and is a majority Black city. I didn't know I was a minority then. It wasn't until we moved to Miami when I was 7. We moved to Miami when I was 7. We also lived in a Black neighborhood, but Miami was not a majority Black city. And the porch for me signified that I was part of racialized space, right? My community, if you've seen the movie Moonlight, that was where I grew up in Miami, Liberty City. And all of my neighbors were African-American like us, varying degrees of class, but no more than middle class. It was clearly a neighborhood that had lots of disinvestment, and that was clearly segregated. This all came to a head in 1980. And some of you may be a little too young to remember this, but when Arthur McDuffie was killed on his motorcycle and the Black community in Miami rioted and went up in arms, right? It reminds me of this moment. $100 million in damage, lives lost, the 4 police officers were acquitted. The porch also reminds me of another kind of racialized space. My mother worked, went back to school, got her PhD. We moved to the suburbs right before I left for college, the white suburbs. The porch then reminded me that we were a minority. We were one of 2 Black families in a very nice suburb of Miami, Kendall. And so when I went out and I looked around from my porch, I saw whiteness. I wasn't sure if we were welcome. And so, 25, 30 years later, not much has changed. And so the porch to me is both a symbol of community and comfort, but also a symbol of racialized space.
And James, did you want to share?
Okay, yes, I'm James Rojas. I'm Latino, born in East LA, and I don't have any great porch stories because as a Latino boy, that was not my space. That was for my sister, my mother, and grandmother, so I just kind of roamed the streets. But I know that it was a really important space for them as a way for them to be kind of plugged in the community and how the role they did. So in my work at MIT, looking at the built environment, I studied from porches as being part of the Latino space. So it became really important as a way to understand that. So I think we have a video of all this. I've been documenting porches all over the country in Latino neighborhoods, from California to New York to Texas to Detroit, and just how the role of design really impacts the way Latinos are using these spaces. So I don't know if we have the video link to show. to Philadelphia. Detroit. Thanks. So it's just a way of thinking about who gets to use space and who designs space and how important that is to the community for their aspirations. You know, how do you aspire to see something better in space? So thank you.
I just wanted to share as well, and I will also, even though Stephen, you started the video, I'll let you also share. I'm gonna say really quickly, I actually didn't have my own porch either. I didn't grow up with a porch, but I have one memory that I have where my family moved all over the country and we didn't really have our family around us. And I had one moment when I was 17 where my family went back to Warren, Ohio, where I was from, and I got to see my grandmother probably for the first and also the last time. And all I remember is that the minute that we parked and got out of the car, the first thing that my grandmother said to me was, "Come here, baby, let me do your hair." And I remember that I had never in my life felt like I belonged to anyone in the way that I belonged to her. And so I didn't have I never grew up getting to know my whole family in that way, like described by Carmen. But I do know that my grandmother had a large heart, and I wish at that moment that I could have known what that space was, because I never felt like that from anywhere in my life before or since. So I just wanted to put that out also. And Steve, if you want to say anything.
I think my video covered it all, and now I'm in tears. Those of you who don't know, Madeline and I are cousins. I've met her brother and sister and father, but never got the opportunity to meet in person. So hearing your story and seeing our grandmother up there, it's taken me to a space. But if you heard it at the beginning of my video, that's how I identified what a porch was. We had porches, but we grew up in mainstream or not areas of color, rather, excuse me. So when I had to dig deep and think about when did I have a porch experience, and it was every summer when I would go home to Warren, Ohio and sit with our grandmother. And she would use that as a sacred space. It was almost like a sanctuary, as I said in the video. And she would give advice and admonish people right there from the comfort of the armchair that was just showed in the picture. And so when I think of a porch, I do think of storytelling. And as I said, I've taken on that mantle of storytelling as a producer through media. And I just think that we all have a responsibility, especially in these dark times, to shed as much light as we can on injustice. Anywhere where there's inequality, we need to be using our voice and speaking up to bring justice for all. That was promised to us in the Constitution, but doesn't often apply to people of color. So I'm honored to be here. I love everyone's stories. And thank you for the opportunity, cousin.
Moving into the next section, I really want to bring back what Jay also stated at the beginning about the fact that why is it that after 400 years, we still don't feel safe off of the porch? And I want to also ask the question of how do these narratives that everybody just shared about porches, how do they impact and inform the spaces in which we live? And I know that each of you as professionals have an understanding of that, and I'd love to hear more about this question. So we can just start with Jay.
As someone who, again, designs and worked on the design and programming and policy of public spaces, I think something that is important to understand in this moment is that people of African descent generally feel unsafe in public space. So we tend to respond to these kind of moments where someone has lost their lives. But in the work that I do, what comes up quite a bit is the cumulative daily ways that Black people are hemmed in as they navigate public space. And there are so many ways that that manifests. So everything from iconic symbols like Confederate monuments, anything from even our absence in the public space. So many cities are built on Black labor. But when you look at plaques or parks or any type of commemorizing of Black labor and Black culture within the public realm, we are invisible. There's a way in which Black people learn to navigate space in a way that is hypervigilant. And so when I think about this moment, even in terms of the expression of Black public rage, I think one of the things that I wanted to insert in this conversation is that there's a real misunderstanding of the expression of Black public rage. People think that we become very angry or incited to anger over the loss of a life or lives, and that would be enough, certainly, but it is so much more complex than that. And I just want to, I think, underscore the fact that Black public anger, the manifestation of it, is a secondary emotion. So psychology teaches us that anger is generally due to, and the expression of anger is a sense of a lack of safety, a lack of self-worth, feeling as though we are worthy and valued in public, and a lack of being heard. And that's from a psychological standpoint. And Black people navigate public space generally carrying these emotions. And as someone who takes up a good amount of space, like I feel pretty, pretty confident and pretty comfortable in space, but I have to say that I feel that way because I have a lot of privilege. And it is also true that I make very distinct choices every single day to protect my sense of safety and confidence. And so I guess when we're talking about safety beyond the porch, I think we have to understand that safety is not momentary or, a single incident. It's multidimensional, and Black people carry a lot of complexity around the ways that we navigate the public realm.
Carmen, would you like to?
Yeah, so yes, space, public space, particularly here, Alabama's home to the Equal Justice Initiative. And if you are familiar with the work they have been doing around cataloging lynchings, it reminds us all just how precarious public space has been historically. And with current events, you can see how precarious public space is. But it also points to an idea of ownership, like whose space is it? And part of that, the idea that Black people are visitors or tolerated guests that have overstayed their welcome, really informs the way people treat Black folks in public space. It's the idea that we don't belong there. And that's very difficult to deal with. And it points to the anger that you see and the idea of occupying that space. So it does mean you want to be in the street. You do see the thriving of organizations like Outdoor Afro, which encourages Black people to explore not just urban public spaces, but rural and nature preserves and state parks and national parks and things of that nature. I'd also want to talk about like how the porch is also not safe. So there has been video, I think in DC. Well, it could have been DC. Don't let me lie on DC, but somewhere else, where people were on their porch and they were still shot with paintballs by the police because they weren't inside the home. There was video of people here in Birmingham. We are under a curfew, and it appeared to be public housing, and they were told that they couldn't sit on the porch, that they had to go inside. And so there seems to be a constant negotiation that Black people experience around where can we be, and where can we be safely. So like it's a very complicated feeling. It's not a complicated thing because it's really about extending the same level of ownership over public space that other people have to Black people.
Did you want to speak, James?
Well, yeah, I think what I just showed you for Latinos, claiming the porch is so important to them. That's like we've arrived here and we're going to do our thing on these porches and claim that space and make it our own. But it's kind of their aspiration to have the space. It kind of makes them stronger and better because that's where they can say, "This is mine." Even though they might not be welcome someplace, but this is where their culture gets passed down. It just gets to this front porch use, and it's about the struggle. It's about their need and aspirations. All take place there. It could just be a small plant that a grandmother puts on their front porch to a big arch redesign of the front porch. But it just really kind of shows that need for claiming space and being safe in the space, and giving people the opportunity to really think about how spaces are being shaped by different people.
And James, you talk a lot about memory and you work a lot with memory. Do you want to share a little bit about how that plays into this as well? Memory and being able to tell your story.
Yeah, well, I think, memory is a part of who we are. I think, that's just, and that story has to be front and center of all the planning processes. If we're gonna design a transportation project or a housing project, start with that porch, start with that memory, start with the very physical way of understanding people use of spaces to really say, we're gonna uplift the story to be part of this infrastructure project, rather than saying, we're gonna build a highway and then you deal with it. But really thinking about memory as a way to understand and how we plan our spaces in the future, so we know that at least our story is going to be embedded in this infrastructure. So I have people talk about their favorite child memories as a way to understand themselves and space and understand the planning process as their process. And just uplift that story and say, that story belongs in all these plans. So now it's their plan, their story, their space. It started from that root, because that's a powerful, that's your DNA for how are you going to feel safe in the world, what you're going to look for, and and how you're going to be yourself in the city. We're looking for that space, that sacred space. Really important for us to do that.
Amber?
Yeah, this brings up so much. And in hearing everyone's story, like James was saying, I'm reflecting more deeply on my own and things that I probably took for granted. You know, growing up in Louisiana, we have a carnival season. And so that's when I hear this, the question, the invitation to talk about permission to use space and feeling safe within a particular space, that's something that actually emerged naturally within that particular culture, because we have this carnival season. Everyone is given permission to come outside. We occupy the streets. It's one of the most nutritive things we do as a community. It fills us to have that resonance with everyone's body and the music and the colors. At the same time, speaking to that complexity, you have, and pardon my humor in this, we call it the gift of segregation. And what I mean by that is, in the place where I was born, specifically Lafayette, Louisiana, the red line is still in effect for the most part. So people generally will stay, especially because we're such an extended family network. If you stay in town, you're staying in close proximity to where you were born. We don't have a desire to cross that line. And that's partially informed by the police state telling us for generations and generations that you didn't have permission to cross that line. So we basically made community staying on our side of the line, so there's a certain sense of permission, of acceptance. But when it comes into this question of safety crossing that line, what it brings up for me is the gaze and how the specifically white Eurocentric gaze is connected to a particular narrative about what it means to have social harmony. And for some people, especially Black racialized people, marginalized people, your presence in some spaces disrupts the social harmony. It disrupts the balance. And whether it is explicit or more covert, the body really is receiving that information. Stress responses are going off from receiving that information, which could be something as simple as a harsh gaze that communicates you're not welcome here. And more so, we don't know how to make meaning of your presence here. It brings to mind in a different setting, but within institutions, a Black person who's in a predominantly white institution, and how your presence creates a ripple effect. So the same within cities. And just to bring back in the point that Jay was making about anger and the expression of collective rage, especially Black rage. I really appreciate you centering and unpacking that anger. That's something that's definitely gone deep into, especially with these unconscious transmissions of non-belonging, right? And one of the things that I discovered in that deep dive was to build on what Jay was saying, that the expression of anger is a secondary emotion. And along with, I think what you said was lack of being heard was one of the causes for the expression of anger. What I found was that there was a whole gamut of needs that were unmet, which also precipitate the anger. So disappointment can precipitate the anger. Betrayal, racism as a form of cultural betrayal to the human species can precipitate the expression of anger. Feelings of being tricked or manipulated can precipitate the expression of rage or anger. Lack of belonging in general can precipitate this expression of anger. So all of these things, I just wanted to add that to the pot of our thinking and co-imagining as we move towards something generative.
Yeah, I think on that point, I think it's interesting because a planner, I have to learn how to be a white person because planning for white people is all about perfection. You either wrong or you're right, and belong or you don't belong here. And that's just the way the planning process works. You know, it started historically in this country. And for me, a Latino, it's about survival. You know, I don't care for how you don't cut your grass. I don't care about what you do in your space, but it's about how we survive and how we have to look at the flexibility in survival, you know, and how we create our spaces our own and not say, well, you're all wrong because you're not doing it the right way. That's not how we should be thinking about our space. It's about survival, and it's not about perfection, because then it's really hard to live up to that expectation, and we're never going to fit that expectation. So why, so it creates this kind of disconnect. Well, I'm second class because I can't be perfect like everybody else. That's why we have to change this whole planning narrative and design narrative. It's about survival and how we survive and respect that.
I think I want to say very quickly, though, that, as Black people in this part of the world, there's been enough of this survival kind of mentality. We have, within the margins, carved out survival starting on the plantation. It is time to create spaces where Black people can move from survival to thriving. And so I think that the state and urbanism, which we know planning and other urbanism professions actually go all the way back to colonization, because it begins with the surveying of land, assessing its value, carving it up, assessing who goes where and who belongs where. It is a very class and race-based practice. And I hear what you're saying about that imperfection, like not embracing this whole idea of planners swooping in with a single solution that's going to make everything perfect. I think, though, when I work in Black communities and with other equity-seeking groups, I am so tired of survival. Black people have created music and dance and language and food in the margins. Imagine what we could do if we were given the geographic and also the imaginary space to be full-fledged human beings. So we don't only exist in the margins of our cities and the geographical margins, we exist in the margins of people's minds.
I want to pick up on something that Jay has said twice. Twice you've invoked history, which I think is great, right? The first thing you said was that our history is often invisible, right? The contributions of people of color, the labor contributions, and others to the construction of not only cities and public space, but in fact to our current society, right? Something that we describe as racial capitalism. And that it makes us, so like that's invisible, right? In public spaces, we're often strangers in our own land, in a sense. At the same time, I do feel like, although our history is invisible, we are hyper visible in public spaces, right? The need to always be hyper vigilant, this kind of racial tax that follows us everywhere and that imposes health and other consequences. I mean, if we think about the way that COVID has hit, and people keep talking about comorbidities, if you dig a little deeper into each of those comorbidities, these aren't lifestyle choices, right? These are stressors, the social and economic determinants of health. So the first thing I want to say is that there's a paradox about invisibility of our contributions, but yet hypervisibility as if we're strangers. I think the second thing I want to say about history, which is something that also Jay just said, is that it's, I find a lot of conversations around, placemaking in the commons. And so I've been very deeply engaged in the question of the commons and the urban commons, really don't take much account of histories, right? The histories of colonialism, the histories of Black land loss in the South and how that happened, the histories of expulsive zoning, the histories of redlining, and the way in which those histories are spilling over into patterns we see today. If I can just come back to Detroit for a moment. I mean, a lot of what we're seeing happening in Detroit, which is my birthplace and where most of my family lives, is outright dispossession, right? Not by straight up colonial means, but something very close. If you look at the tax foreclosures there in Black communities, the enclosures of the common spaces, the urban farms that have been constructed there by African-American communities who remain in the core, you know, very much connected to our history. And so having these conversations about placemaking or public space or even the commons without connecting into that history strikes me as just fraught for making the same mistakes and not really understanding what it is where, you know, not just where we come from, but how we really do build a commons, for instance, a Black commons or a Native American commons. Like, we need to talk more about this history. And so I'm struck by your invocation of history, and I just wanted to put it on the table very strongly.
If I can add to what Sheila and Jay have said, historically speaking, if our contributions to this country have been omitted consistently, then it lets me know that I'm not seen, especially as a Black man. And if I can't feel seen, then I don't feel safe. So to piggyback off of what Sheila just said, it is so important that we continue to have conversations that allows us to speak to this issue, be seen, be felt, be heard, and also that allows us to reclaim our own narrative and allow us to see each other and acknowledge each other. And hopefully by doing that and uplifting each other and coming together with conversations like this, the world will take notice, not just from a hypervigilant perspective, but the full embodiment of who we are as African-American people. We're human just like you, and somehow that continues to get misconstrued and lost in the cracks.
I think part of that is also like, so the disregard of Black humanity and humanity of other marginalized people also means that we're not customers. We're not end users. So when people are designing buildings or spaces or anything like that, we're not thought about. So if it doesn't serve us because we were not included in that process. I have seen more than once when people do renderings of buildings, of developments, and I look at the people that they've put in the buildings and developments, and like there are no Black people. And I always comment, I'm like, you know, where do Black people go in the future? Like, did we go somewhere, or did we go on our own? Did we all just decide to leave here, or like what happened? Like how come we don't exist in your imagination? How come when you imagine a future, Black people ain't there? And so I don't think that's a question that's raised often enough, that when you're designing, particularly for a city that has a majority Black population, more than likely Black people are going to be your end users. We are your customers. And so you should develop an understanding relationship, not much different than in the entrepreneurial world when we talk about customer avatars or customer personas. You need to get to know us in the same way that, I don't know, like Tide gets to know its customers and spends time and understanding who we are and what we need and how we would use this space or use this building. But because we're dehumanized, because we're not considered, we don't get that kind of information. And it's a structural thing, because I don't want to believe that just because you have a Black planner or a planner of color that it's all going to be wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, it's fixed. That's not true. It's baked into the system. It's baked into the curriculum. It's baked into the ordinances about how things should be. And so it's definitely, there needs to be a shift in the way design is done and viewing people who are marginalized as actual customers and end users, no different than the way Facebook views us as customers and end users.
And I wanted to add to that. Thank you so much, Sheila, for bringing that critical element to the table and the critical pull, because one thing I just dropped in the chat is something I've been sitting with for a minute, this concept of the social imaginary, since we're talking about being relegated to the margins, not only in space, but in the imagination, and how symbiotic that relationship is with narratives. with the stories that we're telling, which is what has brought us here to this digital table today. So I feel, especially from my experience moving through Hurricane Katrina and the post-organizing environment, what I recognized at a deep soul level was a need for, I didn't have the language then, I was much younger, but over time I developed this, you know, the decolonial term. There needs to be a decolonial turn in planning as well. And that decolonial turn is where you pull that narrative from the margin. This concept of the social imaginary, I'm just going to read the definition. It's from the field of sociology, anthropology, philosophy, but it's the imaginary, the social imaginary is the set of values, so who's valued or devalued, institutions, laws, and symbols common to a particular social group and the corresponding society, America, through which people imagine their social whole. So the presence of Confederate soldiers, while perceived and received as symbolic violence for some groups of people, for others is an accurate, adequate representation of their social wholeness. And it plays into and is supportive of a particular narrative, supportive of a particular project of dehumanizing a certain group of people, right? And being relegated to the shadows, one of the concepts that struck me deeply when learning about decolonial thought, and I rejected it. I actually wanted to fight with the scholars. I said, no, that's not me. But they have this concept called Black people live in the zone of non-being. They live in a perpetual hell. And I reject, every cell in my body wanted to push this reality away. I was pulling on all of the gifts of my own upbringing, et cetera, which are true. However, when bringing it into the context of the larger social family, the larger social fabric, yes, it is a requirement for some group of people to live in the zone of non-being, to live in the social hell, in order to maintain the purity, the innocence, and the concept of wholeness and balance for white identity. And that affects everything, institutions of design, architecture, policies created. That's the sort of the underbelly, the undercurrent that is sustaining the practices that we have in place. So I just wanted to offer that to the table as something I've been sitting with for a minute now, especially as the narrative and the imagination intersects with the concrete material reality of what we do and create in the world, which shapes the quality of our lives. A decolonial turn in architecture and design.
Hear, hear.
Wow.
Yes.
That is intense.
Oh, Madeline, you know, Madeline and I know each other. We go to the same school and we study depth psychology. And this is what we want to bring from the depths up to the surface that doesn't often enter the dominant narrative or the dominant conversation. Hopefully it can support moving beyond hypervigilance, beyond simply survival to thriving, to a more expansive use of our creative potential and life force, is to bring these other elements up from the deep so that it can inform what we're doing at the surface.
One of the things that really concerns me in my own city and in my own work is that it's about the ability of folks to imagine, to actually imagine something different. Because I started to realize, I was an activist for very many years, and I would protest and say no to things that were going on, to not feeling as if I was participating. And then I realized that I needed to take a stand that was an action, and that action had to be a creative action. And I needed to start visioning what it was going to look like in order for me to move forward. And when you ask many people, and I know like there's writings, like pedagogical writings where it talks about using, like this is Paulo Freire saying, using this idea of the banking method of education, where even that piece is, we're going to school, we're being taught, we don't ever have the space to actually think for ourselves and start to build the ideas of what a place even would look like for ourselves in our city. And when folks fight the ideas of gentrification and you ask them, what would you like your city to look like? A lot of times there's nothing there. It's like a dark hole. And so the question is, how do you move from this act of being silent and not having even a vision to moving towards the ability to begin envisioning space for yourself?
So can I
just say that just really quickly, that people are actually the ultimate placemakers. I just want to put that on the table. We are natural placemakers. You know, I was teaching a course in Detroit with architectural students and then also folks from the community, block club leaders, and a lot of individuals who may not have advanced degrees, who wouldn't understand urbanism talk or the siting of buildings and all of these types of things. But I will tell you that in the work that I've done, especially in cities where there are large Black populations, I will tell you that Black people, just everyday folks on a regular basis, spit knowledge around the public realm to me, like insights that we have. So I just want to say this because in the class, you know, there was a moment where there was considerable grief and pain. And the question was raised, are we forever doomed to be a placeless people? You know, and it was very heavy in the class, and that reality and what you're talking about, Madeleine, is very real. It's a fair question, but I think we can move through the grief a little bit and look at the ways our ancestors and our elders have created place. We are the ultimate, some of the most creative, resilient, intelligent. I just want to put that in there.
Yeah, I just want to echo that because a lot of the work that I do on the ground, not in the classroom as such, but I co-direct something called LabGov, and I have worked even before that in cities like Camden. Right now, we are working with African-American communities and other stakeholders in Harlem and in Baton Rouge, and on visions that the communities are creating and co-creating. I mean, my experience working in all these communities, whether it's around environmental justice or around now the urban commons, and trying to put a name to the work and vision that folks already have and are doing on the ground. So it's not something that academics are bringing. It's something that we're actually, if we're doing anything with it, we're doing it from the ground up, right? So theorizing from the ground up, from the action in these communities. I think it's a real, and you can't ever say for each community, for all communities, but I think we have to start to look at our communities as complex. So let me just, in multi-layered. For sure, there are people that are lacking in communities that do not have the time to go to co-create, to co-vision, to go to a design charrette. There are equally as many people that are constantly engaged in that. And the challenge of our work in heavily racialized, segregated, disinvested spaces, which are almost the only spaces I've worked in, the challenge of our work is to figure out how to help mediate those spaces, neither get out in front of them, nor behind them, but to somehow be in them and be respectful of them and try to find a way for folks to collectively find their vision and to help bring it to the forefront. So I see a lot of, so all my work is around the vision of the commons as an intervention into dispossession, right? Into enclosure, privatized public spaces, privatize spaces that are dispossessing Black and low-income folks and folks of color in general. And so I would say that I see a lot of hope on the ground. I see a lot of design. I see a lot of vision. So I share Jay's sense of that.
Also tagging on to what Jay said, Jay is my new best friend in my head, by the way, as you all are. But the way you package that just has my mind working. I think one of the most powerful mediums that we have is media. But first, before I even get there, we have to work through or figure out how to work through years of generational trauma that we were born into. And we have to give ourselves permission to then dream. I think that a lot of times we're waiting on other people to give us permission, but we have to give ourselves permission. We've got to work through that however you need to work through it, whether it's getting with a therapist, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, talking in forums like this. Give yourself permission to dream and then go do it. I'm speaking specifically to your question, Madeline, about how do we dream or reimagine ourselves or see ourselves. With myself and what I'm doing, using media, like I said, it's one of the most powerful mediums that we have to reach other people. So I have taken on that responsibility of making sure that the work that I create allows our people of color to see themselves reflected in ways that raises their vibration, that raises their consciousness, that gives them permission to dare to dream. And so I think that, I know that there are other producers on this panel, content creators, film festivals. I would love to hear from that perspective. I think media is a really big part of it. What messages are coming to our people to show us that we can do better? Who is taking the initiative? Another thing Jay said, we are thriving, we are seen in every sector of entertainment, we are dominating. But I do think LeBron James, shout out to Ohio, I'm from Ohio as well. LeBron James is doing an excellent job at using his platform as one of the leading NBA players to speak out against injustice. And we need more people who have that influence over the media to speak and to give our young people permission to dream and to give us space by any means necessary. So that's my thought when you're asking, how do we see ourselves differently? I think that we use the influence that we have to combat those negative images that have been put out there in the media. And we use it to our advantage by creating and giving other people the opportunity to dream.
I would like to, so there are 2 points I want to make. One about something I said yesterday about practicing imagination. And so I think what happens is that we'll get you'll get a really excited young person who comes into the planning department. It's like, we're going to do all these planning parties and charrettes, and we're going to do them at different times, and we're going to go into the neighborhood, but they're using the same methods, right? It's the same dots, it's the same maps. There isn't any cultural competency for the way that we engage different populations and how we accommodate their style of imagination. So the way Black imagination works in the United States or in North America, in the Western context, is probably a little different than the way, other folks imagine. It's gonna sound different, it's gonna feel different, the way it's expressed is gonna be different. It may not, we have our own language. So, I mean, it's not necessarily something that can easily translate into what you already know and understand about how to plan or how to design. And so there has to be there has to be a liaison, there has to be an interpreter working there to make sure that what people are actually communicating and as they practice and become more comfortable with imagination. Because it's not just Black people don't imagine, it's that we just get disappointed so much. Like, you come here, you ask us what we want, and then we tell you what we want, and then you go do something else. And it's like, well, quit coming over here if you just go do something else. Like, just leave us alone. So it's a lot of that too, but it requires consistency from the institution as well as a culturally relevant approach. As it relates to the media, well, what we see online is Black people creating more content online than almost anybody, right? And so it's almost at a point where we have these media images coming from larger contexts, whether it's movies, commercials, TV shows, but you also have Black people creating what they want to see in a virtual space. And then that also gets co-opted from time to time, and people don't get paid, nor do they get credit. But, I think that there is, if we can reconcile that, if we can reconcile what information that we're creating, what content we're creating, and use that to inform what we need to be building in the real world, I think that would be, that would create a dynamic that would be, in some respects, revolutionary.
All right, Carmen. Okay, I see you. So I got to touch this piece here about institutional betrayal as a form of structural racism. Because in my work, I do a lot of work, the decolonial turn in maternal public health. And in working with mothers on the ground in San Francisco Bay Area, Bayview, Hunters Point, and whatnot, that is one of the first things they said to me. They say, listen, don't sit up here, come over here and ask us what we want and need to shift these outcomes, because you're about the 17th person to come over and ask us what we need. And then you run back to your institution and you don't do anything with the data. So why do you keep coming to ask me what I need if you're not going to do anything with the data, right? This is what structural racism looks like. This is what, or how it functions, and what institutional racism looks like. It is that dynamic, that relational dynamic of collecting the information and then doing nothing with it. So speaking to what Madeline's point was of the impoverished imagination, there are things that contribute to the impoverishing of an imagination. I absolutely wholeheartedly agree with you, Jay. Black people, racialized African to Black peoples in the United States and the diaspora are some of the most incredible genius placemakers that we've seen so far. Incredible. And the thing that really resonates with me or is most pronounced is the way that the body, in this flight of displacement, the body became the first home. It is always the first home. It was the first site. You have stories of seeds being braided into their hair. You have stories of different herbs being carried. The only reason we have okra on this continent is because of those peoples. The only reason that our agrarian society could flourish is because of the genius of these peoples who came and tended the land. So as far as placemaking goes, the altars that were built, the home, you know, the history of the granny midwives who brought placemaking rituals for the birthing process, who brought these rituals and built beauty all around. Not to mention the African indigenous spiritual technologies that we carried over throughout the diaspora. So when thinking about the impoverished imagination, there's a lot that goes into it. I'm really behind this piece and supportive of this piece around media and imagery. And yes, not only African Americans, Black people in the West, but across the globe. African peoples on the continent are some of the most dense content creators that we've yet to encounter. And something that does is it disrupts, or something I want to see more of, is stories like this, imagery like this, that we're talking about and looking at the seeds braided into our hair, looking at not only the possibilities of, but look at what we already did and how that informs what we want to do and where we want to go. And that is a disruption of the destruction of knowledge, the destruction of historical knowledge that contributes to our cultural and social amnesia, you know, that contributes to the impoverished imagination. If you can see it one time in your mind's eye, or you can witness it somewhere else, you have a greater possibility of actually creating it. You have a greater capacity for believing it could exist and not falling for the okie doke when they tell you it's not possible. Yes, it is possible. Yes, it is. Look at what we've done before.
Can we quickly cut to Fay, because I know you have something that you've been wanting to say here too.
Yes. So I'm just going to give a shout out to Hollywood. I'm going to give a shout out to Black Panther. And that story of Black Panther, the way they cut from Wakanda to the scene of a barren basketball court, is exactly this narrative of how can we see the future, which is Wakanda, in the present moment, which is this barren basketball court, that is the reality of where we are. And that is the incredible magic of that storytelling and the incredible magic of media right now, where we can be in the past, present, and future simultaneously. And even if I'm reading about the set design and the fashion design and the incredible amount of research people put into weaving in all the different cultural touchstones from Africa, from the American South, from here and there, it's all included in there. So the past, present, and future is in Black Panther, and that is why that film is incredible. And I think Black Panther 2 is coming out. Is that right, Steve?
In a couple years. To add to that, and to add to what Amber said, that was so beautifully said, I'm honored to be in the room with all of you tastemakers and policymakers and room shakers. when it comes to imagery and showing people that they can be more through the media, one story I want to share with you guys, you'll have to DM me later for the full details, but for the sake of being on the World Wide Web right now, I produced a docu-series, with Oprah Winfrey on her network called Black Love. And no one really expected it to be a hit because prior to that, people thought that we as African Americans did not marry, that we didn't know what love was. And actually the show was birthed because it was birthed out of the fact that when Obama got in office with the show, some pundit went viral by saying this type of love does not exist. And so the creator of that show, my good friend Cody Oliver, she immediately went to work because it was her thought that seeing is believing. And so she began to document stories of married couples. And then that's when I came on board and brought my clients. And we're almost like the little engine that could. No one believed it, from advertisers to marketing execs to network execs. I said it and I didn't mean to say it. And we blew up. It was the #1 docuseries on her network because we took the time to normalize our experience and normalize our stories. And a lot of our viewership, believe it or not, is not African American. It is Caucasian and others, because they're, choosing my words carefully, they're intrigued with learning more and seeing more. And that's why there's a responsibility on all of us, especially as storytellers, to tell our stories, to normalize our stories, because seeing is believing. Just wanted to add that point into what you guys are saying. We're trying to do all we can as storytellers. We do understand the responsibility that we have as influencers, as creatives, as producers, and we need more eyeballs, we need more support. When this content comes out, we can't complain when it comes out, because then we don't have more of the content to combat the negative stereotypes that are in the media. So anything that we see as Black, not that we need to receive anything that's Black, because some art is not good art, but we have to be intentional about supporting our young Black creatives in the movement and the modern day renaissance that's going on. I appreciate Spike Lee and the other filmmakers for what they've done, but there's a whole new generation of content curators, even online, as someone brought up earlier. We have to be intentional about lifting up our young Black creatives so that our narrative can be owned. So that's my thought.
And just as you're bringing that up, something that Jay actually mentioned earlier is when we talk about media and we look at the role and the influence of media, there is this question of how is it that we are perceiving Black bodies represented, for instance, right now? And I mean, because this is where the battle comes in of the content being produced by the news. And I know that we had a clip, actually, Steve, and it actually was a friend of yours who was actually in a protest. And I don't know if we have that being tuned in right now. I think he's putting it up. But I wanted to talk about that because this is what we're up against many times also. And there we go. You can talk a little bit and tell us maybe about.
So my friend, his name is Kendrick Sampson. He's there in the cutoff t-shirt, African-American young man. He has an organization called Build Power that we've been putting together for the last few years to fight police brutality. And we had a peaceful protest just this past Saturday in Los Angeles. And out of nowhere, LAPD swooped in. And because he was on the front lines, he was beaten live on CNN. But I have shared with him, he's become a martyr for the movement with a purpose. It was divine because he brought attention to what the LAPD has been doing for years. Those of us who are old enough to remember 1992 with Rodney King, history is repeating itself. But because he's a celebrity, he is on Insecure, if anyone's watching that, which is created by a friend of mine, Issa Rae, who worked her way up from the internet to now having the top 10 show on HBO called Insecure. So he's on Insecure. So that moment went viral because of his celebrity. It shouldn't take that, and I want to speak to that. It irritates me that celebrity does not always equal credibility. I want to say that. Shout out to any of my friends that are watching in the industry, but it's irritating that we have to first use our voices collectively to bring about justice, just like we just had to do for Ahmaud. It should have never happened. And it irritates me also that Jay-Z had to be the one to call to the prosecutor to get things handled and get these charges. However, that's the way how our world works. So I believe Kendrick being on those front lines, it was unfortunate, but now we've been able to defund the police. I don't know if you guys have heard here in Los Angeles, they were getting ready to give them $3 billion. And because of our efforts, because of that viral moment, we were able to get them to reduce that budget by $2 million, which will now be redispersed to communities of color, simply because of the campaigns that we've been doing, that viral moment, and we understand, again, going back to, we understand our purpose and we're on the front lines. So because of those efforts, that $2 million will now be redispersed to communities of color, and I'm really proud of that. Horrible depiction in the media for Kendrick, but he was a martyr for a purpose.
Also,
I would just like to say, I would like to be friends with your friends.
They're good people. I met these people. I've been in LA 13 years. And so we all met at the beginning of our careers in television and film. And it's been a blessing to watch all of our journeys evolve and now get to stand on the front lines when it's important for matters that moment. It's not about a celebrity or a photo op. Yesterday we met and we had Megan Good and we had the cast of Blackish, and there were so many people who used their voices collectively for change to fight against all of the things that are affecting our people. So I'm happy to be, I'm happy to use the influence that I have to bring those people together to speak up.
We have a question that's coming in from a Danya, and she asks, I want to know how, as an outsider, when you are working on the ground with a community, you don't waste the residents' time and build that trust for a long-term association. Even though I am a person of color, I don't feel like I'm qualified to expect communities to engage with me in deep discussion.
I mean, my answer to that would be, I've never gone into a community where I'm not invited, first of all. And second of all, I think that, communities of color have understandably histories of distrust, because a lot of the development politics, the money, whether it's coming from the federal government, the city or private, has often been promised development money and lots of promises around amenities and investment have often been promised and not delivered, or not delivered fully. So whether you're a person of color or not, I mean, expect a lot of distrust from any outsider coming in. And so I think that's the reality of the situation. And for any of us in this work on the ground, I always go in humbly and being asked, basically. And so I'd be curious about others' responses to that.
I would agree with you, Sheila, 1,000,000%, especially as I recognized very early that although I'm a Black person, so I live in a city that is 8% Black. And so getting to work in cities with much larger Black populations, I think one of the things that I was very mindful of early is that just because we look alike doesn't mean that we have the same history or the same politics or approaches. And so what you said, Sheila, about walking humbly, the other thing that I do not do is parachute in a team from Canada to an African-American city. I hire and pay teams locally because I respect local knowledge, right? So I become a part of a team that exists where people are already doing work. And I bring up payment very specifically as well. So it's not extractive or like mining the expertise, of local knowledge, but something that I keep in mind quite a bit, two things. One is reciprocity. So when I go in to do a project, there's a scope of work that I'm given, but I know that I have an accountability to Black communities or equity-seeking groups that is always outside of the scope of work. So whether that is I might give some mentorship or share a particular skill or cut the data in a particular way so the communities can use it well after I'm gone, I always ask at the front end, what it is I might leave with the community and what they might actually receive from the process. And I think that's so important. I just want to take a quick minute to say that it got emotional for me about 10 minutes ago, because I just realized that I miss being in conversation with African Americans so much. It's just, I love people in Toronto. I'm sure if my Toronto peeps are watching, they might not love that statement, but I just want to say that, like, so much of what I know about public space and what I know about cities, I have learned from African American elders. I have learned because of the generosity of people who take me on very intimate walks in their neighborhood. And the last thing that I'll just say is that although my work takes place in the public space, someone earlier said, you know, the approach, like the cultural competency needs to be different for our communities. And I just want to say that sometimes my work, although it's public space, it starts in a kitchen where I am co-cooking with community members and like sharing my grandmother's jerk chicken. Y'all love Jamaican food. So I come in and I share like my grandmother's, you know, Caribbean recipes, and then African Americans share their recipes. And that's where the public space design work starts. It actually doesn't start in public or with dots or at a design charrette. It actually starts in deeply personal, private space with community members who've been there and doing the work all along. And I'm just really grateful. That's all I just want to say.
The one small thing I would add to that excellent, all those excellent points, is that I also think you have to leave something behind. You know, these communities are tired of academics and others coming in to study and to look at them and to learn. I mean, that's not how you go in, even if you're asked. And just coming back to only what I do, whether it was environmental justice, now the commons, I mean, I'm interested in leaving behind institutions, resources, capital, and putting communities in a situation where they are the long-term stewards of those resources. And that's what the commons is about to me, right? It is creating stewardship, you know, that is controlled by communities. They're not the only ones in control. I'm not trying to privatize assets either. I don't think that's the way to go, but, you know, but centering communities and keeping them there. So when I'm long gone, my team is long gone, whether that's after years or months, whatever, there is something left behind that's sustainable and lasting, and that's theirs. So that's something I would add.
I'll offer a little bit to this piece. Thank you, Jay, for bringing in the word reciprocity, because that is something, that's a value which was removed within the colonial project of dehumanization, right? So Danya, if I can offer anything, it would be to echo what Steve and others have said on here. You're absolutely accurate. Your phenotype or being a person of color or identity designation does not give you automatic entry into anything. Consent and invitation and reciprocity should guide and frame everything you do. It should inform your intention. One of the ways that I look at it in the work that I do is this idea that oppression distorts relationships. And so my work, my responsibility in the work is to cultivate right relations. It's to cultivate permission and consent. It's to cultivate a real grounded median or porch or interstitial space that's going to bring us together in the first place, as opposed to any sort of missionary driven, savior complex sense of urgency that's rooted in my hypervigilance or my guilt. Put all of those things to the side. That is not good medicine. That is not good medicine to support right relationship. So you're absolutely right in that intuitive feeling. Just because you're a person of color, you don't have entry into every space, even with other groups of color. In fact, I would go so far as to say, using that logic to guide your work in the world is rooted in the same logic that made you, relegated you to the margin because you're a person of color. So it's important that we really critically analyze that and self-reflect on that. Of why would it be that just because I'm a person of color, I have all of the answers to anything? It's just not true. So I'll offer that. And good luck.
James, was there something that you wanted to say? I noticed that you had written, he's on mute. You're on mute. James, you're on mute. Oh, there you go.
How do we change the tools of engagement to get people engaged? So what I do is I use storytelling, objects, and play, especially for Latino women that use their hands to cook, clean, and take care of business. So their hands are how they communicate. They're not going to read a map. They're not going to be able to value skills they don't have. But by having to build their stories and kind of building that vision, then they have power. Because now they realize I could design my own street, I could design my own park. I just built it out of objects, and that's what the way I use to kind of create that kind of power in community and kind of leave them with that vision. You can do the planning, you have power to do planning, but really changing the tools of engagement to really change the outcomes of the planning process. We have to respect your stories and memories and just have them think about their bodies in these spaces and make it really real for people, not just an abstract land use plan. But it's about that front porch and how that comes out in the transportation plan and the housing plan and the economic development plan. That's it. Thanks.
I have to say that echoing what Jay said, I feel like I am learning so much. And one of my biggest things about today was just to be able to feel, I know this is such a clunky space to be online and I've never seen in Zoom conferences, it's very hard to have like a round table dialogue. But I have to say that I feel like I fell into it and I knew that this group would be able to do that. And it's so beautiful to me. And I knew the minute that somebody just started to talk that it would move through the space. And I just want to say that I'm very thankful for that, for all of you, because if there's anybody who can have a conversation, I know that it is Black women, people of color. It is us. We know how to talk and we know how to share from the heart, have a real dialogue and go deep.
Preach.
And blessings to you, honey, and all your guides, to your grandmother, Madeline, to your beloved grandmother, because you picked the right people to be in conversation and it flowed naturally. So thank you.
This was awesome, truly. Thank you. A blessing in these harrowing times. A bright spot, really. Thank you.
Thank you, Madeline.
I love you. I don't know that I've ever ended a public conversation in this way, but I just want to say I appreciate all of the panelists, and I'm going to take this moment, and I know that this conversation was very Black, and I think it needed to be in this historic moment, and I think we need to honor all of the Black bodies on the street and Black bodies experiencing risk. And I want to say that I value all of the panelists, and I also have to say a very specific and special I love you to the Black folks who've shown up to do this while we're also holding a lot of grief and trauma around what's happening to our community.
I thank you, Madeline. As Amber said, I absolutely consider our grandmother to be a guide, and I know that she brought us together for such a time as this, for this conversation, so this is beautiful. It was cathartic for me. I feel better. I've been very down. When I first got the invitation, I was like, I'm not in a space, I won't be present because of everything that's going on, but this is definitely cathartic. I feel great. And in talking about space, my last thought is I've partnered with an organization who gives us space to be us, that the Black women and people of color watching may be interested in. It's called the Crown Act. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but we are helping to create legislation to stop discrimination in the workforce against women and men because of their natural hair care. So I was intentional in wearing this shirt today. We've got California who signed on board with this law, Virginia, New Jersey. I think we're at about 10 locations. So I think it's important to continue to partner or give light, give visibility to organizations who have been doing the work, not just when it's convenient, but who are committed to the long-term change. And this organization has been doing this for about 6 months. So I was intentional to those who have asked about this shirt. And I really appreciate this opportunity, and I feel great. Thank you guys. I love everybody. Let's stay in touch, hopefully.
Absolutely.
So I want to thank you for inviting me into this space. I feel very honored. I just want to add another story. When my family moved to the United States, my dad told me that we are here because African Americans fought for our civil rights. That the Civil Rights Act was passed in '64, and then the Immigration Act was passed in '65, and that let a lot of people from Southeast Asia to come into the U.S. So that we are beholden and we need to fight for our civil rights alongside the folks who helped us come to the States. And so I feel really honored to be part of this. Thank you.
Thanks, Madeline. Great seeing you again, and hopefully we'll work in Santa Ana again.
All right.
Thank you. And I think that in the chat box, I know folks, if you guys want to put your information or where people can get a hold of you, if other people would like to connect with you. I know that the bios have gone in, and I know that there's also been more information, but if you want people to have a direct connection, you and what you do, please share.
Madeline, I'd just like to share thanks as well. I think it's important to give strength and to give capacity to go forward, that you do talk about the future. And so often that we think about talking about what we want to see is abandoning the work that we have to do in the present. But for me, and I know for a lot of people, it reinvigorates the work that we're doing in the present when we talk about what we want to see in the future. And so I do appreciate this space and this time to talk about how it will be when we get on the other side. And I just think that is I'm very grateful. I think it's a wonderful opportunity, and I hope that the people watching got as much from it as I did.
I'm very thankful that we got to sit on the virtual porch today together.
Me too. Shout out to Ryan on production.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Absolutely.